Archie was so little, and I had just gotten pregnant with Lily around that same time, so we were nesting.
Meghan has been rushed to the hospital right after the palace dropped a sudden announcement that no one saw coming. Witnesses say she stopped mid-step, whispering, "Not now, not like this." Within seconds, security and medical teams surrounded her, moving fast as the atmosphere shifted from calm to crisis. The palace corridors, usually filled with quiet order, exploded with whispers and worried faces. Something big has broken through the royal shield today, something they can no longer hide. And what follows may shake everything. When the past comes calling. Meghan's children knew a version of her best, the mother who sang off-key in the morning, who kissed scraped knees with theatrical concern, who made ordinary moments feel magical simply by being present. She had built a life around these small, precious things, a life where peace was not just a dream, but something she could actually touch. That particular morning had begun like so many others in her carefully constructed world. The house stood quiet in the early light, wrapped in the kind of silence that feels like a gift. She moved through familiar rooms with unhurried grace, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cool floors. Steam rose from the cup of tea cradled in her hands as she stood by the window, watching the garden come alive with dawn. Her thoughts drifted lazily from one tender memory to another. Her daughter's laughter from the evening before, the way her son had fallen asleep holding her hand, the sanctuary she had finally managed to create for them all. This was her haven, her refuge from a world that had once demanded too much. Then her phone shattered the stillness with a sound that made her stomach drop. The ringtone was not the cheerful melody she had chosen for friends or family. This was different, urgent, official, a tone she had programmed years ago and hoped never to hear again. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the device, already sensing that whatever waited on the other end would change everything. The voice that greeted her spoke with barely controlled urgency, words tumbling out so quickly she had to grip the counter to steady herself. Each syllable hit like a physical blow, carrying news that seemed impossible to comprehend. The palace, that institution she had tried so hard to leave behind, had just released an announcement. The details felt surreal, involving someone whose name still carried the weight of complicated history, someone she had never expected to be thrust back into her life this way. The caller continued speaking, explaining circumstances that made no sense, but Meghan's mind had already begun to spiral. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a force that frightened her. Old wounds she had carefully tended, scars she thought had finally faded, suddenly felt raw and exposed again. Memories she had worked so hard to process came flooding back with startling clarity. The loneliness of those palace halls, the feeling of being utterly misunderstood, the painful choices that had led her to this new life. She had believed those chapters were closed, that she had moved beyond the reach of that world and its endless complications. Before she could even begin to process what she had just heard, her body delivered its own devastating blow. A sharp, searing pain exploded in her side, so sudden and intense that she gasped aloud. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the counter as both hands flew to clutch at the cause of the agony. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts that would not satisfy her burning lungs. The room began to tilt dangerously, as if the floor beneath her had transformed into a ship's deck in a storm. She reached out blindly, her fingers finally finding the edge of the table, gripping it with desperate strength. The pain was unlike anything she had felt before, not the dull ache of stress or the sharp reminder of an old injury, but something deeper and more terrifying. It spoke of urgency in a language her body understood even as her mind tried to deny it. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air. Colors seemed too bright, sounds too loud. Every instinct she possessed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Through the fog of pain and shock, a fierce clarity emerged. She could not wait. She could not pause to think this through or convince herself it might pass. Every fiber of her being insisted that hesitation could cost her everything, not just her own well-being, but her ability to be there for her children, to finish raising them, to see them grow. The thought of her babies finding her collapsed on the kitchen floor propelled her into action despite the agony radiating through her torso. "Help!" she managed to call out, her voice hoarse and strained. "I need help right now." Her hands shook violently as she grabbed her coat from its hook, struggling to pull it over her shoulders while the pain continued its relentless assault. She fumbled for her phone again, her fingers barely cooperating as she dialed for assistance. When someone answered, her words came out in fragments, urgent and pleading. "Hospital. I need to get to the hospital immediately. Something's wrong. Please, there's no time." She could not articulate the terror that gripped her, the primal fear that if she waited even one more minute, she might lose her chance. The palace announcement, the shocking news, the reopening of wounds, all of it suddenly paled in comparison to this immediate, physical crisis. Yet somehow the two felt connected, as if the emotional blow had triggered this bodily rebellion, as if her system had simply reached its breaking point after years of carrying impossible burdens. As she moved toward the door, each step an exercise in willpower, one thought consumed her completely. She had fought too hard for this life, loved too deeply, to let it slip away now. Whatever was happening inside her body, whatever chaos the palace had unleashed, she would face it. But only if she acted right this very second. What would happen if she convinced herself to rest, just for a moment, to catch her breath before seeking help? What precious minutes would be lost? Minutes that might mean the difference between returning home to her children or leaving them to navigate this world without her. When love and fear collide. Harry loved fiercely and without reservation, especially when it came to his wife and children. They had become his entire universe, the reason he woke each morning with purpose. His capacity for devotion was both his greatest strength and his most vulnerable point. The news reached him in fragments, each piece more devastating than the last. He was in his study reviewing documents when his phone began vibrating with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The palace announcement flashed across the screen first, words that seemed designed to wound, a statement so unexpected and cold that he had to read it 3 times before its meaning sank in. His hands went numb as decades of complicated emotions surged through him. How could they? After everything, after all the distance he had put between himself and that institution, they still found ways to reach into his life and tear open old wounds. Before he could even process his anger and hurt, a second call came through. This one made his blood turn to ice. Meghan had collapsed. She was in pain, serious pain, and was being rushed to the hospital. The words barely registered as coherent thoughts. His mind could not connect them into a reality he was willing to accept. His beautiful wife, who had been laughing at breakfast just hours ago, was now in an ambulance fighting something neither of them understood. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice breaking on the last word. Everything else fell away in that instant. The palace and its calculated cruelty became background noise. His only thought was reaching her, being beside her, making sure she knew she was not alone. He grabbed his keys with shaking hands and ran for the door, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. Duty, protocol, appearances, none of it mattered now. Fear stripped away every other consideration. The drive became a nightmare of red lights and slow-moving traffic. Harry gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, weaving through lanes with barely controlled desperation. Each stoplight felt like a personal punishment. His mind raced faster than the car ever could, spinning through worst-case scenarios he could not silence. What if he arrived too late? What if the last thing he had said to her that morning, something casual about picking up groceries, became the final words between them? Please, he found himself saying aloud to no one and everyone, please, let her be okay. Please. As the car crawled forward through congested streets, unwanted memories forced their way into his consciousness. Another palace announcement years ago, delivered with the same detached formality. That one had changed the entire trajectory of his life, setting in motion a chain of events that led to exile, estrangement, and endless public judgment. The institution spoke in carefully crafted statements that landed like bombs on real human lives, destroying relationships and futures with perfectly punctuated sentences. They never seemed to consider the people left to pick up the pieces, the hearts broken by their cold calculations. This new announcement carried echoes of that same tone, measured, official, devastating. It felt like a message designed to remind him that no matter how far he ran, no matter how new a life he built, the past maintained its grip. The timing felt almost cruelly deliberate, as if the universe or fate or some malicious force wanted to test exactly how much pain one person could endure simultaneously. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the hospital came into view. Harry abandoned any pretense of calm as he pulled into the parking area, barely remembering to turn off the engine before he was running toward the entrance. The automatic doors seemed to move too slowly. His legs carried him forward on pure adrenaline and terror. The hospital assaulted his senses immediately. Antiseptic smells burned his nostrils, triggering memories of other hospitals, other moments of waiting for news about people he loved. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow that made the walls look sickly yellow. Voices murmured from nearby rooms, some crying, some laughing, all blending into a soundtrack of human suffering and hope that he could barely process. Harry's hand reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling so badly he almost could not grasp it. He took one shaky breath, whispered her name like a prayer, and pushed forward into the unknown. What condition would she be in? Would she be able to speak to him, to tell him what happened? Or would he find something so much worse that his mind refused to even imagine it? Secrets behind golden doors. On this particular morning, tension hung in the air like fog refusing to lift. Staff members moved through the hallways with unusual caution, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets that had witnessed generations of crisis. "Have you heard what the announcement says?" a junior secretary whispered to her colleague near the servants' staircase. "Only bits, but enough to know it will cause chaos," came the anxious reply. Throughout the building, similar conversations played out in fragments. People who had dedicated their entire careers to protecting the institution now wondered if this latest decision would help or harm the very thing they loved. The uncertainty was unbearable. They understood that once certain words left these walls and reached the public, there would be no taking them back. The world would react, and the palace would once again find itself at the center of a storm it might not be able to weather. Deep within the administrative wing, senior advisor Thomas Pemberton sat alone in his office, the official statement resting on the desk before him like an unexploded bomb. He was a man who had served the crown for nearly 4 decades, who prided himself on measured responses and careful consideration. His reputation had been built on his ability to navigate impossible situations with grace and wisdom. But today, even his steady hands trembled slightly as he reread the words for perhaps the 100th time. Thomas understood exactly how serious this announcement was. Every carefully chosen phrase carried implications that would ripple outward in ways they could anticipate but not fully control. The decision to release this statement had not come easily or quickly. It had been born from fear, not the childish kind that makes one jump at shadows, but the cold, calculated fear of leaders who see disaster approaching and must choose between terrible options. "God help us all," he murmured, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. The statement had been crafted and recrafted, with lawyers examining every word for potential legal consequences and communications experts analyzing how different audiences might interpret each phrase. Yet despite all the preparation, Thomas knew in his gut that this would explode in ways they had not fully prepared for. The timing was impossibly delicate, the subject matter was explosive, and the people involved were not abstract concepts, but real human beings whose lives would be forever altered. Behind the heavy oak doors of the council room, an emergency meeting had been convening for hours. 7 people sat around the antique table, their faces reflecting various degrees of stress and exhaustion. These were individuals who normally maintained perfect composure under any circumstances, but today their masks were slipping. Foreheads creased with worry, mouths pressed into thin, anxious lines, eyes darted between faces, searching for reassurance that no one could provide. Lord Ashworth, the most senior among them, looked as though he had aged a decade overnight. His usually impeccable posture had collapsed into something approaching defeat. "We have no good choices here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many crises. "Every path leads to damage. We are simply trying to choose the least destructive option. But this could destroy relationships that are already hanging by a thread," another advisor protested, her voice tight with concern. "And silence could destroy the institution itself," came the sharp response from across the table. Each decision they contemplated felt dangerous, loaded with potential for catastrophe. They debated the wording again, though the statement was already finalized and scheduled for release. They discussed damage control strategies, media responses, potential legal challenges. But beneath all the professional discussion ran a current of genuine fear. These were not heartless bureaucrats. They were people who understood that their choices affected real lives, including some they had known personally for years. The silence between exchanges grew heavier as the meeting wore on, each pause feeling louder and more oppressive than the words themselves. In those quiet moments, doubt crept in. Had they considered every angle? Were they about to make a terrible mistake? Would history judge them as protectors of the crown, or as the architects of its downfall? At the center of the table, commanding everyone's attention even when no one looked directly at it, lay an old file bound with faded red ribbon. The folder itself looked innocent enough, a standard government issue from decades past, slightly worn at the edges, marked with classifications and reference numbers that meant nothing to outsiders. But everyone in that room knew what it represented. This file contained information that could fundamentally alter the narrative everyone had accepted for years. The documents inside told a story that contradicted official records. They contained witness statements, private correspondence, medical reports, and legal opinions that painted a picture so different from the public version that its revelation would shake the foundations of everything people believed they knew. Only 5 people in the entire world knew the complete contents of that file, and 4 of them sat in this room right now. The burden of that knowledge showed on their faces. "If this ever becomes public," one advisor began, then trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "It must never become public," Lord Ashworth stated firmly. "But its existence forces our hand. We cannot remain silent when we know what we know. The risk is too great." The file represented the real reason for today's announcement. Not politics, not strategy, not even malice, but fear of a truth that was beginning to leak around the edges despite their best efforts to contain it. What exactly did that sealed file contain? What truth was so devastating that it forced the palace to issue a statement that would hurt people they once called family? What secret burned so dangerously that even these experienced advisors looked frightened by its weight? When silence becomes survival. Meghan had built her entire world around protecting that love, creating a safe space where her family could simply be themselves without judgment or expectation. A nurse adjusted the blood pressure cuff on her arm, the squeezing sensation making Meghan wince. Another checked the IV drip, making minute adjustments with practiced efficiency. A third stood by monitoring equipment, watching numbers climb and fall on screens that meant nothing to Meghan, but clearly meant everything to them. The world around her kept slipping in and out of focus in a nauseating pattern. One moment she could see the worry etched into the face of the young doctor adjusting her monitors, could count the individual threads in the curtain someone had partially drawn around her bed. Then everything would blur and darken at the edges, as if someone were slowly turning down the lights in the room. Colors bled together. Sounds became muffled and distant. She felt herself drifting away from her own body, observing the scene from somewhere far removed rather than experiencing it directly. Terror gripped her throat, making speech nearly impossible. She wanted to communicate, to make them understand something important, though that something kept escaping her grasp. Her lips formed words that dissolved before they could be heard. She managed only fragmented sounds, broken syllables that carried no meaning to anyone listening. "I can't, please." The words emerged as barely a whisper, weak and thready. Her arm lifted with tremendous effort, hand reaching out into empty space with desperate purpose. Harry should be there. She wanted him there, wanted the solid reality of his presence to anchor her to consciousness. Her fingers stretched and grasped at nothing but air, finding no hand to hold, no warmth to cling to. The absence felt like another injury, another wound layered on top of the physical crisis consuming her. Fear became a tangible thing, a crushing weight settling on her chest and making each breath even more labored. Time stopped following normal rules. Seconds expanded into eternities. She existed in an endless present moment where suffering stretched out infinitely in all directions. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her, its second hand crawling forward with agonizing slowness, while simultaneously racing ahead too fast for her to track. A doctor whose name she had not caught leaned over her, shining a light in her eyes that made her want to turn away. "Meghan, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you understand." A palm pressed into hers and she tried to respond, tried to show she was still present and aware, but her fingers barely twitched in response. Beyond the curtain, out in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the corridor, Dr. Marcus Webb pulled Harry into a consultation alcove with an expression that spoke of serious complications. Marcus had delivered difficult news to countless families over his 30-year career. But something about this particular case unsettled him in ways he could not quite articulate. The clinical facts were concerning enough, but there were elements that did not fit the usual patterns he had come to recognize. "I need you to understand how delicate this situation is," Marcus began, his voice low and controlled. "Your wife's body is showing signs of extreme stress response, but the severity is disproportionate to what we would typically expect. Her blood pressure is dangerously unstable. Her heart rate is erratic. We're seeing indicators that suggest her system has been pushed beyond its normal capacity to cope." Harry's face had gone ashen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What does that mean? What are you telling me?" "It means something triggered this response, something significant enough to overwhelm her body's ability to regulate itself." Marcus paused, weighing his next words carefully. "In my experience, this kind of acute presentation often follows severe psychological trauma, a shock to the system that manifests physically." The implication hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Harry's mind immediately returned to that morning, to the phone call, to the palace announcement that had arrived like a bomb detonating in their peaceful life. Could institutional cruelty truly have this kind of power? Could carefully crafted words released with official authority actually damage someone physically? Inside the examination room, medical staff continued their urgent work. Blood samples were rushed to the laboratory. Scan images appeared on screens, showing internal landscapes that told stories the doctors were still trying to interpret. Medications were adjusted, dosages recalculated. Specialists consulted through urgent phone calls that carried tones of genuine concern. Dr. Sarah Lynn, the youngest member of the team, noticed something that made her pull up Meghan's admission records on her tablet. Her eyes tracked back and forth between the timeline and the palace announcement that had begun trending online within the same hour. The correlation was striking, almost exactly simultaneous. Her symptoms had begun within minutes of that statement being released. "Dr. Webb," she said quietly when Marcus returned to the room, "I think you need to see this." She showed him the timeline, pointing out the precision of the overlap. Marcus studied the data with growing unease. In medicine, coincidences happen all the time. The human body was complex, and illness rarely followed convenient schedules. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, as though someone had known exactly what effect their actions would have and had proceeded anyway. Harry stood at Meghan's bedside now, his hand wrapped around hers, his thumb moving in gentle circles against her palm. He whispered assurances he was not certain he could keep, promises that everything would be fine, that she was strong enough to get through this. But watching the monitors track her unstable condition, seeing the concern that the medical team could not quite hide, he felt his own fear threatening to consume him. Was this truly a coincidence? Or had someone understood exactly what weapon they were deploying and against whom? And if the latter, what did that make them? And what did it mean for the invisible war being waged in the shadows while Meghan's body paid the price? A husband's impossible choice. Harry stood in a small consultation room adjacent to where Meghan lay fighting for stability, and every bit of that hard-won freedom felt meaningless in the face of what the doctor was telling him. The walls seemed to lean inward as Dr. Webb spoke, each medical term landing like a physical blow. Harry's hands gripped the back of a chair to keep himself steady, his knuckles white with the force of his hold. The stress her body experienced was profound enough to trigger a cascade of physiological responses, Dr. Webb explained, his tone gentle but unflinchingly honest. Her cardiovascular system is compromised. We're managing it, but the next several hours are critical. Any additional shock or trauma could push her into a more dangerous state. Harry felt his eyes burning, tears gathering despite his desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control. He blinked rapidly, but moisture escaped anyway, tracking down his cheeks in paths he did not bother to wipe away. Fear coursed through him with such force that he thought he might collapse right there beside the chair he was clutching. Will she survive this? The question came out hoarse and broken, barely recognizable as his own voice. Dr. Webb met his gaze with compassion but refused to offer false comfort. We're doing everything possible, but I need you to understand. Her recovery depends not just on medical intervention, but on eliminating whatever caused this crisis in the first place. If the trigger remains active, her body may not be able to heal properly. Before Harry could fully process those words, there was a knock on the door. A hospital administrator entered, followed by a man Harry recognized immediately. James Thornton, a mid-level palace official he had not seen or spoken to in over 2 years. The sight of him here, now, in this place of crisis, made Harry's grief instantly transform into fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" Harry demanded, his voice low and dangerous. James looked uncomfortable, clutching a leather folder against his chest like a shield. I was sent to provide clarification about the announcement. We learned that Mrs. Mountbatten Windsor had been hospitalized, and there were concerns about timing." Concerns about timing? Harry's voice rose despite the clinical setting. "You released that statement knowing exactly what it would do to her. Don't stand there and pretend this was some accident." James's face flushed, but he pressed forward with the message he had been sent to deliver. The decision was made at the highest levels. There were reasons, urgent reasons, that mandated immediate action. A journalist had obtained certain information. If we had not controlled the narrative, Harry stepped toward him, barely restrained rage radiating from every muscle. "My wife is fighting for her life because you people decided to protect yourselves. You knew this would destroy her, and you did it anyway." The leather folder trembled in James's hands. Inside it, Harry could see the edge of official documents, more carefully worded justifications for cruelty dressed up as necessity. The palace had sent this man here not to apologize or help, but to explain why they had been right to do what they did, to make Harry understand that institutional preservation always took precedence over individual suffering. "There's more you need to know," James said quietly, his eyes dropping to the folder. "The sealed file, the one that prompted the announcement. It contains information about succession, about legitimacy, about claims that could undermine—" "Get out!" Harry's voice was deadly calm now, more frightening than his earlier anger. "Get out of this hospital before I do something we'll both regret." James hesitated, clearly torn between completing his mission and preserving his own safety. Finally, he set the folder on a nearby table and retreated, leaving Harry alone with Dr. Webb and the weight of impossible choices. The doctor had witnessed the entire exchange with professional discretion, but now he spoke carefully. "Whatever is happening between you and that institution, you need to resolve it or remove yourself from it entirely. Your wife cannot recover in an environment where attacks can come at any moment." Harry sank into the chair he had been gripping, his head falling into his hands. Before him lay two paths, both terrible in their own ways. He could stay here at Meghan's bedside, holding her hand and praying for recovery, while the palace continued its calculated assault from a distance. Or he could confront them directly, travel back to England and demand answers, force them to acknowledge the damage they had caused. But doing so would mean leaving Meghan when she wanted him most. Neither option offered anything resembling victory. Both came loaded with consequences that would ripple through the rest of their lives and the lives of their children. If he stayed silent, the palace would interpret it as weakness and continue their campaign of institutional cruelty disguised as official business. If he fought back publicly, they would paint him as unstable, use his anger against him, and probably escalate their attacks in ways he could not anticipate. He thought about the sealed file James had mentioned, about secrets that apparently threatened the very foundations of succession. What information could be so explosive that it justified this level of ruthlessness? What truth was the institution so desperate to suppress that they would weaponize official announcements against a woman in fragile health? Harry stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city beyond without really seeing it. Everything he had feared for years was materializing around him like a nightmare taking solid form. The announcement that had shattered their morning peace, Meghan's collapse. The sealed file containing God knows what revelations. All of it converging into a perfect storm that threatened to destroy everything they had sacrificed so much to build. He had spent years trying to escape the suffocating grip of the institution he was born into. He had chosen love over duty, peace over position, authenticity over appearance. And still they would not let him go. Still they reached across oceans and years to remind him that their power extended beyond any border he could cross, that leaving their service did not mean leaving their reach. A nurse appeared at the door. "Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, your wife is asking for you." Harry turned from the window, wiping his face with the back of his hand. The choice could wait a few more hours. Right now, Meghan wanted him beside her, and nothing else mattered more than that. But as he walked back toward her room, he knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over. The battle he had been avoiding for years had finally begun in earnest. The palace had drawn first blood, and they had done it in the most cowardly way possible, by targeting the person he loved most in this world. They had calculated that he would either surrender completely or destroy himself fighting back. They thought they knew him, thought they could predict his response. They were wrong. Harry pushed open the door to Meghan's room with new resolve hardening in his chest. He would protect his wife and expose whatever truth they were so desperate to hide. He would make them answer for what they had done, and he would do it without sacrificing the man he had fought so hard to become. The storm was here, and for the first time in his life, Harry was ready to meet it head-on. But was he truly prepared for everything that readiness would cost him and everyone he loved? The price of truth and the power of love. Meghan was not someone who wanted grand gestures or constant excitement to feel fulfilled. Her happiness lived in the small, tender details that others often overlooked. Even now, lying in a hospital bed with her body still recovering from a crisis that had nearly consumed her, there was something peaceful about her stillness. Her face, though pale and drawn with exhaustion, carried a serenity that came from knowing she was loved and protected. She had fought her way back from the edge, and though the battle had left her weak, It had not broken her spirit. The room around her had finally settled into quietness after hours of urgent activity. Medical equipment hummed softly in the background, monitoring her vital signs with gentle persistence. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed to something more merciful, casting everything in a softer glow that felt almost sacred. Outside the window, the city had grown dark, its usual noise muted by distance and glass. Inside this small space, time seemed suspended, held in place by the weight of what had happened and what might still come. Harry sat in a chair pulled close to her bedside, his body angled toward her as if even in sleep she might need him. He had not moved from that spot for hours, had refused every suggestion that he rest or eat, or take even a brief walk to clear his head. His eyes remained fixed on her face, tracking the rise and fall of her chest with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Every breath she took felt like a gift he could not take for granted. Every flutter of her eyelids reassured him that she was still present, still fighting, still his. His hand covered hers on the white hospital blanket, his thumb moving in slow, unconscious circles against her skin. He memorized the details of this moment, the faint hospital smell of antiseptic and clean sheets, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the way her hair fell across the pillow, the warmth of her palm against his. If he could have frozen time right here, kept them safe in this bubble where nothing could reach them, he would have done it without hesitation. But the world outside this room continued moving forward whether he wanted it to or not. Miles away, in corridors he had once walked as a child, the institution that had shaped and then rejected him was preparing its next move. The palace never truly slept. It simply shifted into different modes of operation, different strategies for protecting itself against perceived threats. In a secure conference room deep within the administrative wing, Lord Ashworth sat with his remaining senior advisors as midnight approached. The sealed file lay open on the table now, its contents finally being discussed with the brutal honesty that crisis demanded. They had spent hours debating their options, each path forward seeming worse than the last. The world would soon demand clarity about the announcement that had caused such upheaval. Journalists were already asking pointed questions, legal representatives were making careful inquiries. The truth they had worked so hard to contain was beginning to leak through cracks in their carefully constructed narrative. "We cannot maintain this position much longer," one advisor said, exhaustion making her voice flat. "If we do not provide answers, someone else will provide them for us, and their version will be far more damaging." Lord Ashworth looked older than he had that morning, the weight of decades of service suddenly visible in the lines of his face. "The sealed file cannot be released, not in full. The implications would be catastrophic. Then we need to control what does get released," another voice interjected. "Give them enough truth to satisfy curiosity while protecting the most sensitive information." They knew the risks of that strategy. Partial truths often created more problems than they solved. But complete transparency would destroy foundations that had stood for generations. They were trapped between impossible choices, much like the man they had once called Prince, who now sat in a hospital room holding his wife's hand. In that quiet hospital room, as the night deepened toward its darkest hours, Harry found clarity emerging from the chaos of his thoughts. He had been wrestling with the decision since James Thornton had delivered his veiled threats disguised as information. Stay silent and protect his family's immediate peace, or speak out and risk everything in pursuit of justice and truth. For hours he had gone back and forth, weighing consequences and calculating risks like he had been trained to do since childhood. But sitting here in the darkness, watching the woman he loved breathe, he realized that his heart had already made the choice. Reason and strategy had their place, but they were not the compass he wanted to follow anymore. Love was his guide now. Love for Meghan, for their children, for the life they had built away from golden cages and calculated cruelty. And that love demanded that he stop running from the institution that had hurt them, and start confronting it with the only weapon they truly feared, the truth. He would not let them hide behind official statements and sealed files anymore. He would not allow them to weaponize their power against vulnerable people and then retreat into protocol and tradition when challenged. Whatever secrets that file contained, whatever revelations they feared, he would drag them into the light where everyone could see them clearly. Not for revenge, though he certainly felt the burn of that desire. Not even for vindication, though that would be satisfying, but because silence had failed to protect them, and only truth had any chance of setting them free. "I know what I have to do," he whispered into the quiet room, speaking to Meghan even though she slept. "I know you would tell me to let it go, to focus on us and our family, but I cannot do that anymore. They have to be held accountable. The world has to know what they are willing to do to maintain their power." As if sensing his resolve even in sleep, Meghan's fingers tightened slightly around his. Her breathing remained steady and peaceful, but something in that small gesture felt like permission, like understanding, like partnership even in unconsciousness. Dawn came slowly, light creeping into the room degree by degree until the darkness could no longer hold its ground. The first rays of sunlight touched Meghan's face, and her eyes fluttered open for the first time in hours. She looked disoriented at first, her gaze wandering around the unfamiliar room before finally landing on Harry's face. When their eyes met, something passed between them that wanted no words. Relief, love, gratitude, and determination, all woven together. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. "Always," he replied, leaning forward to kiss her forehead gently. "I will always stay." But even as he spoke those words of devotion, his phone began vibrating on the side table. Messages were coming through, notifications piling up as the morning news cycle began. The palace had released another statement overnight, not a retraction but an expansion of their previous announcement. They were moving forward with their strategy, doubling down on their position rather than backing away from it. Harry read the new statement with growing anger, but also with something like relief. They had made their choice, and now he could make his without guilt or hesitation. The gloves were off. The pretense of family loyalty and private discretion had been abandoned by the institution itself. They wanted a public confrontation, and he would give them exactly that. Meghan watched him read, saw the transformation in his expression, and understood immediately what it meant. "What are you going to do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I am going to tell our story, all of it. Every detail they tried to bury, every truth they twisted, every moment of cruelty they justified in the name of duty and tradition." His voice was steady now, filled with purpose rather than anger. "I am going to make sure that the sealed file does not stay sealed. Whatever they are hiding, the world deserves to know." Meghan reached for his hand, squeezing with more strength than he expected given everything she had been through. "Then we do it together. When I am strong enough to stand beside you, we face them together." Outside, the sun continued rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that promised a new day. The storm that had broken over them had not passed. If anything, it was gathering strength for another assault. But something fundamental had shifted in those final hours of darkness. Fear had given way to determination. Silence had been replaced by resolve. And the truth, so long buried beneath official statements and institutional power, was finally ready to emerge.